Good afternoon, community, and thank you so much for joining us for today's virtual conversation with Cara discussion. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathleen St. Louis Caliento, and of course, I have the pleasure and honor of serving as president and CEO for Cara Collective. Conversations with Cara is our year-long series of virtual and in-person discussions that are centered around both our work and the issues that we face in our mission to eradicate poverty. In honor of National Hispanic Heritage Month, we are thrilled to be joined today by a panel of experts from the civic, philanthropic, and higher education sectors to discuss how we can work together to build economic vibrancy across the Latine community. We encourage you to be part of the conversation today. Share your thoughts, any questions that you have for the panel in our live chat. We will have time at the end for Q&A, and we're going to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We have an incredible conversation ahead of us. So to get us started, I'd first like to introduce my friend, colleague, and moderator for today's conversation, Cara Collective's Chief External Affairs Officer, Tara Harper.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and good afternoon, community. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Tara Harper. It is an honor to be here today, moderating this important and timely conversation, building economic vibrancy across the Latino-Latina community. This topic is also one that is deeply personal for me. As the proud child of a Dominican father and a Puerto Rican mother who first came to the States in the mid-60s, searching for better academic opportunities for themselves and eventually their 6 children, I witnessed the struggle my parents went through, making the difficult decision to leave their home after years of moving back and forth from the DR to the States, to permanently establish Chicago as our new home, with no family, no network, and no established community. Ultimately, their decision, one that is familiar to many Latino families, was based on their need and desire to find steady employment and careers that would provide family-sustaining wages. To understand the complex issues that exist today within the Latino community, it's helpful to briefly explore our history. While we don't have time to go into our vast past, there are a number of pivotal moments over the past century that have helped shape the current Latino workforce and have also continued to create barriers to meaningful employment opportunities that are still experienced today. The first wave of Latino immigrants came to Chicago in the early 1900s. This group was largely made up of young Mexican men in search of jobs and opportunity. While they were promised permanent employment, this was seldom the reality of their experience, and oftentimes were exploited and used as temporary workers during times of union strikes. The population grew quickly, going from 1,000 in 1916 to 20,000 by 1930. And they mostly settled amid dominantly immigrant neighborhoods where industrial factories and access to jobs were prevalent. Communities such as South Chicago, back of the yards, and near West Side. Then in the 1950s and 60s, Chicago saw a second wave as Puerto Ricans began immigrating to Chicago en masse, citing rampant poverty and unemployment as their root reason. However, Puerto Ricans did not move into the already existing immigrant neighborhoods, likely because many of the industrial factory jobs were already on the decline, leaving restaurant, janitorial work, and delivery stockroom jobs as the main source of employment opportunities. By the 1970s, the number of Puerto Rican residents in Chicago had more than doubled from just 10 years prior. And as they grew in numbers, they saw themselves forced out of largely white communities that had originally settled in through acts of racism and widespread systemic housing discrimination. Today, the Latino population continues to be the fastest growing demographic in the United States. However, countless historic and current systemic practices continue to create significant barriers to economic mobility and are only widening the racial wealth gap. From housing discrimination, neighborhood gentrification, historically lower paying jobs, language barriers, complicated pathways to citizenship, continued racism, and the lack of recognition and understanding of the incredibly diverse cultures that exist within the Latino community. To further unpack all of this, I am thrilled to be joined today by our panel of speakers to discuss how this has impacted the labor force and how we can better support this untapped talent to build economic vibrancy. Each of our panelists brings a diverse mix of expertise, backgrounds, and perspectives to the conversation, and all are fierce advocates for our community. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Let's take a quick moment to meet today's panelists. Would love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Ignacio, if I could start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this amazing panel and an absolutely needed topic and discussion. But I'm Ignacio Lopez. I'm the Deputy Provost at National Louis University. NLU is a 137-year-old institution, a nonprofit university. We're an HSI. We serve over 10,000 students in the city of Chicago. Several of our undergraduate students are Chicago Public School students. We have over 77 different programs at the university. And are really committed to diving into career preparation-based programming to enhance the lives of our students, in this case, mostly minority students. That's what I do, my day job, my afternoon, and other work. You'll see me as board president of the Puerto Rican Art Alliance here in the city of Chicago, supporting and promoting our cultural events across the city of Chicago, music school and music programming as well. But happy to be here, happy to be part of the panel, longtime Chicago grew up in the city. I'm a product of the Chicago Public Schools, and again, just happy to be here and engage in this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Christina, can I kick it over to you?
Yes, thank you for putting this fabulous, illustrious panel together and also bringing up this topic for critical discussion across our city. I'm the first Deputy Chief of Staff for Mayor Brandon Johnson in the city of Chicago. I formerly served as a state senator on the Northwest side in the 20th Senate District. And prior to that, just had a ton of experience in nonprofits and policy organizations, but probably the past 12 years has been squarely focused on early childhood and the policy and advocacy space. So tons of stuff to discuss with respect to workforce, and really excited to kick off this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Miguel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And I'm really honored to be part of this group. I am the executive director of the Legal Aid Society. The Legal Aid Society is the second oldest provider of free civil legal aid services in the country. We've been in place for about 135 years, and we are part of the larger umbrella organization, Metropolitan Family Services. And we provide free legal services across the metropolitan area. And I myself have been a poverty law attorney for about 20 years now, and mostly have focused my work on employment issues, immigration, and anti-human trafficking. So thank you.
Sylvia, let's round out the panel.
Sure, great. Thanks, Tara. So good afternoon. I'm Sylvia Garcia, and I serve as the Chief Operating Officer of the Chicago Community Trust. For more than 100 years, the Trust has served as the region's community foundation, connecting philanthropy to impact and addressing the critical needs for our most vulnerable residents in the Chicagoland area. I'm about a month into this job, so I'm bringing a lot of other experience, but really excited to be here. I've spent the majority of my career working in government at the local, state, and federal level, really trying to think about ways to connect folks with impact and access to economic opportunity. So I'm very excited to be at the Trust and being part of their strategic work focused on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, and really excited to be a part of this discussion here today. I think workforce is front and center and is really that key pathway to opportunity and closing the wealth gap. So thank you so much for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I could not agree more with you. So let's jump right in. As we know, we have a rich culture and have long been a part of the fabric of this wonderful city. But as we also know, we have continued to face significant barriers and systemic racism for generations that have stunted our collective ability to achieve economic prosperity. I want to start with a question for the entire panel. What progress have you seen in recent years, and where are we still falling short? Miguel, if I can start with you.
Yeah, I think certainly there has been progress, but I do think it's important for us to reflect a little bit on the history of what brought us to where we're at. Certainly in the United States, many Latinos fall into what we call the low-wage economy. Many of the jobs you talked about in your introduction, and many work in farm work in areas outside of Chicago that we might not know about, but that provides food for the entire nation to eat. And that entire system really is the remnants of slavery and what sort of set our low-wage economy in the status it's in now. Back in the 1930s, when some of the New Deal legislation was being proposed by Roosevelt, the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Board Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the only way to pass that was to try to exclude African-American workers who at the time were mostly farm workers. And as history moved forward and we went into World War II, a lot of those jobs were replaced by Latinos, brought in the Bracero program and other things like that. And so many of the things that excluded workers at the time, like overtime pay and being able to unionize and being able to pay into Social Security, still remain in effect for many of the jobs that we see Latinos in today. So I think while we're seeing some progress now, we still have a lot of work historically to really try to remedy those laws that were put in place in the first place.
Wonderful. And Ignacio, from your perspective, what are you saying?
Yeah, so thank you. And I agree with Miguel. I think understanding and the history is important, because I think when I think of this question, I sort of bucket it into sort of three areas, right? And it's sort of a both end, because it's still progress but barriers, or still room to grow. And sort of the first big areas around, Latino individuals, leaders, et cetera, in terms of our political representation. There's been movement in that space to see more elected officials, although clearly we can keep doing more. That's a big bucket. The second bucket is around our social movement. I think it's been really great to continue to see the growth in our Latino communities coming together to be visible with regards to various social justice movements, including fights against racial discrimination, police violence, et cetera. And so the collective organization within the Latino community, especially in the city and across the country, I think that really is really important. But there's still progress to do. And then lastly, I think in my mind, as someone who's been in education for 20 years, I think there's been some nice progress, right, in our work in education, especially in higher ed, how we're seeing supports for our DACA students and the DACA immigration reform work. I think increasing the language supports that we're seeing now more in schools, both in the K-12 and higher ed sector. I think all that is really great. So there's some movements there. Clearly, there's work to do. Lastly, I just want to say, we're headed into an area, I'm sure Christina can add to this, an era where, the Chicago schools are going to have elected school board, which is great. But we're hoping that we have representation in these elected seats as well. While we're seeing progress in these areas, I do think that there's still room to grow and see further representation in some of these areas.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think that there's some interesting pieces of legislation that have recently passed that, the Latino community stands to gain from and benefit. One in particular that we were really proud of a couple of years ago is the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that would essentially establish opportunities within the green economy, particularly for individuals who are from communities that are known as environmental justice communities, which we know many Latinos are residents in those particular communities. But what's great about it in terms of not just establishing goals around, climate, but there's also going to be a trades and apprenticeship opportunity with these employment hubs that are in very discrete locations across the state to ensure that we can have more Latinos, more African Americans in this particular industry. I think another area, to really speak to in terms of like opportunity, and, Ignacio had touched on it, the state has made unprecedented investments in the MAP grant, which, helps to subsidize access and obviously the tuition and fees for universities. And we are actually seeing more and more Latinos complete degrees in higher education. One of the bills that I advanced was really about making sure that even in our high schools, we are being very deliberate about promoting multiple pathways in post-secondary education, not just the four-year institutions, but also careers in technical education, trades, and apprenticeships, because those are obviously viable careers. And, oftentimes Latinos have kind of been pushed and not able to participate in that particular sector. And so I think we have to be really deliberate about not just setting goals and expectations, but also normalizing and ensuring that folks have pathways. I think another area I want to lift up, because there's a lot of Latinas specifically, is in early childhood, right? We have an early childhood professional workforce that is predominantly women of color, immigrants, refugees. And one of the bills I was most proud of was the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity. And what this particular bill does is establish a consortium across the state with 2-year and 4-year institutions to design pathways that are for the incumbent workforce. That is, individuals who are already working in the field of early childhood, but who occupy the lower rungs and obviously make less money. And what this is meant to do is remove all barriers: scholarships, fees, childcare, transportation, student loan debt forgiveness, the coaching and the mentoring to get to and through the degree, so that we can upskill up to 5,000 individuals, that being the majority women and women of color. And then lastly, super proud, on Friday in City Council, we just passed an ordinance, one fair wage. We are eliminating the sub-minimum tipped wage. This is also going to be a game changer for Latinos, because majority of our tipped wage workers are people of color, particularly Latinos, immigrants. And so I think, we have a lot of opportunity in kind of various sectors to be able to seize this particular moment. And as we think about it, and I know we'll get into more discussion a little bit later, particularly how this is going to play out for our new arrivals. But that's the tease. I'll pass it over to Sylvia so she can round us out.
Perfect. Thanks, Christina. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to kind of go last on this group, because I think the trust is really focused on all of these different components of what everyone's talking about. Back in 2019, the trust launched a new 10-year strategic plan focused on closing the wealth gap. And that came together after kind of surveying the landscape of what would be most impactful, where's the trust can play a role. And I think the wealth gap underpins all of the things that folks are talking about here, right? I think it's really thinking about how we increase that access to opportunity, be it through education, workforce development, all of the different components that folks have talked about so far. And so I think over the last few years, we've really focused in on that. And I think we've been able to make some progress. I will say that the pandemic has, exacerbated some of the issues that we've seen before, but I think it was also a unique time. And so I think over the last couple of years, we've really been able to invest in increasing incomes through workforce development, thinking about how we invest in communities and make them stronger, and really thinking about how we help small businesses and entrepreneurs flourish. So I think there's a lot that we're doing at the Trust that cuts across all the work here. And I'm really excited to dive in a little bit deeper as we go forward in this conversation today.
Thank you. And I'm so encouraged to hear about all of the things that are happening, particularly at the policy level, when we at Cara Collective are always thinking about how are we increasing those employment pathways to those meaningful and family sustaining wage and job opportunities, right? And so really thinking about how are we creating opportunities to upskill our labor force is such an incredibly important part of the work that we do. Sylvia, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, which is the pandemic. And we cannot have a conversation around workforce and the economy without actually talking about what happened during the pandemic and kind of what we are seeing as a result. And as you mentioned, what we know is that it truly did exacerbate all of the existing systemic and racial inequalities that had already been plaguing our communities, from the employment and health outcomes and everything else. When we look back at 2020, when the pandemic was first surging, the national employment rate was spiking to about 12% for our Latino workforce, which was 41% higher than the white unemployment rate at that time. As we are starting to move, and I always say cautiously, optimistically, starting to move to the other side of the pandemic, what are some of the key learnings about how it impacted the Latino workforce, and how can we better support and help move individuals into jobs that provide, again, those really critical family sustaining wages? Sylvia, I want to just start right back with you, since I know that this is a topic that the Trust has really been focused on.
Sure, happy to jump in. And I think you're exactly right, that exacerbating the inequities, I think, was really difficult, because I think we were starting to make progress in a lot of areas. But I do think the pandemic created a big spotlight also, right? And so I think it gave us an opportunity to test drive different things, and really was an opportunity for innovation in the government and philanthropy space. I think we saw a lot of different emergency response. I always think of it as kind of two buckets of emergency response initially, of like just how do we get money to folks in need. And I think at the Trust, we had our COVID relief funding where we brought people together. I think the Trust plays a big role as a convener, and bringing people together in partnership and getting people to collaborate. And so the opportunity to get folks together and say, people are hurting, and let's make sure we're getting that money to Black and Brown communities that are being disproportionately impacted. So I think that was really critical on the front. And then I think the second bucket to me is that moving to economic recovery, great. Like now that we've stabilized a bit, how do we go forward? And we've really had an opportunity to do innovative things in that space with money coming from the federal government, from the state government, and from funders across the region. I think we were able to create our We Rise Together program and a number of new funding tools to really try to meet that moment. To me, when we think specifically about workforce, the area that I laser in is what everyone else has been sharing about barriers, right? I think those barriers that existed pre-pandemic were even more so, right? Childcare, transportation, being on the front line, being a frontline worker and having to navigate healthcare, all of these different components really came out front and center during the pandemic. And so one of the things that we've done at the Trust is launching our Income Growth Solutions program that's really looking at how do we help assist with some of those barriers? How do we help make sure that people have those supports while they're getting training, while they're starting those jobs? Apprenticeships are key. How do we build that pathway? But we know, most Americans cannot go weather through a financial crisis. And so thinking about how do we provide some of those supports and those additional wraparound services, I think is really critical. And to me, seeing that be done in kind of an innovative way during the pandemic and coming out even stronger now post-pandemic, I think is a great opportunity to treat the whole person and make sure that we're helping people succeed. So really excited about the work that's happening there.
Thank you, Sylvia. Miguel, I know when we were talking offline, one of the things that you were mentioning is that what we saw during the pandemic was that feeling of disconnection from the overall community, and how so much of that was also being driven by that digital divide, which became even more prevalent during the pandemic. So maybe would love to hear from you a little bit on that topic as well.
Yeah, I think it really demonstrated in many ways, sort of oddly, the richness of the Latino community and how many wonderful things that we maybe took for granted in many ways, the arts, the foods, the things that we enjoy and share, but all of those things immediately that are in-person activities were sort of put on hold in a way that really affected the communities of color, especially Latinos in many industries. And so for many of us who immediately jumped to even like what we're doing today, virtual formats and things, and we were able to continue doing a certain amount of work, for many people, they were highly isolated, lost out on many opportunities because they didn't have that information available to them as readily as it was to other people. And so I think it really just demonstrated that going forward, we really need to look at that as an opportunity into where we invest and to recognize the resources that people are lacking in order to truly fulfill their dreams and be able to be part of the economy in a way that's sustaining.
Yeah. And Nagasio, I'm curious, one of the things that we've been talking about is that there was some progress that was being made pre-pandemic, right? And then a lot of that stalled, but the importance and the role of higher ed and what that looks like as we come through this pandemic. I'm curious as to what are you seeing from your end as well?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's great. I'm just sort of reflecting on what both Sylvia and Miguel said. I think our biggest learning, clearly, Latino-owned businesses significantly impacted during the pandemic. A lot of entrepreneurs struggling to rebound. I think those themes in terms of like struggling to rebound, we saw in higher ed. A lot of our Latino students are slowly now starting to come back, this fall and in the winter. So that's nice, but you can see that folks were struggling to get their finances in order to get back onto these particular tracks. I do think it's up to us, though, like how can we help, right? That's sort of like the central question in my mind. I do feel like universities, we need to get real about what is the cost to attend, right? If National Louis can create a $10,000 a year undergraduate bachelor's degree where you can get almost fully funded for, if you qualify for zero EFC on the Pell Map, you can go to NOU for free, right? Like if we could do it, other schools should be thinking about, wow, how else can we be access-based and access-driven and still offer quality education programming? I think that those are areas that I think we still need to get better at and grow in and still learn. I also feel another big learning, and it was mentioned a couple of times. I know Sylvia mentioned our apprentice programming. That work is real, right? The micro-credentialing, medical assistance programming. These are fast-paced, credentialed, opportunities that individuals can go right into sort of the working field, sort of those earn and learn models that I think are really important. But I got to say, in my experience, we can't do this. Universities can't do this alone. We need, we'll say this again a little later, but we need our employer partners to dream with us, right? Because if we've got, students that want to go into Cisco system certification, they're still training, but can you hire them and we can collaborate on getting them certified to get what they need? So those sort of advanced paths to these career-related opportunities, they're key. And, there's only so much universities can do. I argue we can keep doing more, but we can't do it alone. We do need that partnership in some of those workforce development paths.
And it's such an incredible point that I want to lift up as well, right? That you mentioned around affordable higher ed options for folks so that they feel that there is a path that they can take where they may not have that generational wealth and access to them, right? And so how are we ensuring that young folks or folks anywhere in their life have that opportunity to do that? I know I'm a parent of a middle child who goes to National Louis University, and incredibly grateful that she will not be coming out in debt. Right. And so when we think about what it means to build that economic prosperity and not just mobility, it is also how are we thinking about ensuring that folks are not coming out with a ton of debt in order to start to build that next generation of wealth. So really, really appreciate your comments there. I'm going to pivot just a tiny little bit on this question for a moment. And forgive me to my panelists. As you know, I sometimes like to jump around a bit on topics. So I'm going to jump just a little bit because Christina, I want to circle back to something that you had mentioned at the top, which is during the pandemic, part of what we saw was this mass exodus of women from the workforce, right? And this was certainly not unique to Latino, but it certainly was felt within the Latina community. And so I'm curious, as we're thinking about folks kind of coming back into the labor market, what can we and what should we be doing so that we are better supporting and providing better support for women who want to re-enter, but then have the opportunity to both grow and thrive in the career of their choice, right? Because choice is something that we should all have the dignity of having. So, Christine, I'd love to just kind of start with you on that question.
I mean, I think we have to just acknowledge that, women wear multiple hats, and, there's, it's sort of an uneven distribution of, what we call like the silent work, right? If you are raising a family, keeping up the schedule of the kids and all the appointments and doing the paperwork and so on and so forth, helping with the homework, all of those things. And so we have to think about when we're particularly trying to support comprehensively and holistically women in the workforce and Latinas, like we have to be deliberate about, it's not just about pay. And it's not just about like the traditional benefits. It's about how do we cover childcare? How do we ensure that there is adequate paid leave? How do we make sure that mental and behavioral health resources are readily available? How do we be deliberate about coaching and mentorship? How do we think about competency-based sort of evaluation so that if somebody doesn't have a traditional degree, but they have a ton of lived experience and professional experience, how do we translate that to be just as valuable as having a 4-year degree? All of those things come into play, but it does require a suspension of a traditional kind of ideology in terms of how we look at workforce. I mean, the same thing too, I think that's incredibly important is flexibility and scheduling. I mean, you talk to anybody and, having the having the ability to work remotely or to flex your time is something that, like, before the pandemic was kind of like looked at sideways, and now, you know, there is a very apparent tension with employers right now and employees who have become accustomed to that, so much so that they're not going into particular industries or just taking up any job that's offered to them if there isn't that opportunity to kind of have that flexibility. So I think all of those things come into play and is going to force, you know, employers to think more holistically as they are trying to not just recruit but retain high talent who just endemically juggle a lot and get a lot of things done, but don't get compensated for it in the multiplicity of ways that they could.
I can definitely attest to everything that you're saying as the mom of 3 children, as the working mother of 3 kids. Even though some of them are adult children, that juggling is a constant tension. And one of the things, you know, that I just want to lift up and kind of double click on that you mentioned is, you know, how are employers showing up in this conversation? How are they thinking about changing their policies, their practices? How are they trying to be much more, like you said, flexible and ensuring, you know, a lot of companies these days have a lot of DEI initiatives for hiring, but it's how are we retaining that diverse talent as well, right? And I know that that's a critical part of the work that we do here at Cara Collective as well. Sylvia, I want to make sure I give you a couple of moments to also talk on this particular topic, because I know that it's one that you all at the Trust are also addressing.
Yes, happy to jump in. And I mean, I think Christina knocked it out of the park. I wouldn't add anything else to that list, but I think it's, like you said, double clicking on it. There's so many ways that women are pulled in so many different directions. And I think that happened quietly before, but I think everyone saw it in real life, in real time during the pandemic, right? Like the guest stars, as I called them, the little, you know, junior members of the team that would join on Zoom and other things like that, but it really helped people see the need for childcare, the need for flexibility, and the fact that really, if we want people to be great members of our team, we really need to recognize, again, the whole person and meet them where they are and think about that. And so one of the things we're working on at the Trust is definitely thinking about policies and how do we help promote that for employers. I think the other thing I'd love to chat a little bit about is related to people dropping out of the workforce, right? I think there were a lot of folks that were like, I can't manage this. I can't balance all these things. I think the silver lining of that is we actually saw in Illinois record growth in small business creation. And I think a lot of folks had that like glimmer in their eye, that little dream of like, maybe I can start my own business. And the pandemic did create this moment where people were at home trying to be creative and think about how do I become an entrepreneur? And so I think especially Latinas, I think of my tia Blanquita, who started an arts business back when I was a kid and grew it into like this whole full career. I think there's a lot of passion and creativity for non-traditional roles as well. And so I think thinking about how we support entrepreneurs and building that network at the Trust, we do invest in small business supports. And I mentioned before our We Rise Together program, which was actually putting capital money in to catalyze physical locations for small businesses and really help them grow. So I think we're really focused on that. How do we help everybody find their path, and entrepreneurship may be one of those paths. The We Rise Together program also made some investments in workforce development centers, creating those physical spaces for people to get back together and think about how they enter the workforce or re-enter in a way that works for them. So really excited about the work that's happening in that space.
Wonderful. Miguel Ignacio, I certainly do not want to leave you out of this important conversation. Is there anything either of you would love to contribute to this topic?
I can add, and then Miguel, sorry, you can jump in. I have 2 thoughts. So, last month I was able to attend the White House initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity for Hispanics. A long title for initiative, but in that space with regard to supporting women in education and leadership and workforce opportunities, I think the pattern, or the word that sort of kept coming up, I mentioned this during our previous call, was around la colectiva, right? There seems to be a need, a want for, and absolutely agree that the spaces and places where women leaders can be genuinely themselves with respect to navigating, questions or doubts that they may have about their organization or about their finances, about their struggles, and feeling like they can have those conversations genuinely without being or fearing any sort of, judging or whatnot, maybe from male counterparts. And so I think that was a really fascinating sort of topic that came out of that particular place. I do want to shout out, the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement here in the city of Chicago. Mujeres de Hace is a great example of how we're sort of organizing and how we're seeing groups organize to better support and address, advancing these opportunities for women and women leaders. And then I'll just say one quick anecdote, and I can pass it on to Miguel. But it is very interesting. A few years ago, I was able to be leading entrepreneurship work out of the Graduate School of Business here at National Louis University, where we were looking at serving women leaders or women startup companies. And it was fascinating to do a deep dive study on the questions that venture capitalists would ask women entrepreneurs or founding women leaders versus the questions that their male counterparts were being asked when they were trying to pitch their particular, organization, product, et cetera. And so the ratio of sort of financially related questions for women outweighed those of men. In other words, it's quite interesting to see why we were focusing so much on tell me more about your business. Is it really going to be viable? Tell me about the money. Tell me about where you're going to see your revenue. Tell me more about your margins, as opposed to when some of the men were pitching their, stories or organizations. They had some financial, but the majority turned out to be about, well, what else can the product do? Or how else are you going to be able to reach? And so it was dynamics of how women are treated in some of these particular entrepreneurial spaces I think we should be mindful of. And I think that's on us. That's on all of us, both men and women, to be conscious of oh man, what really is equitable in these particular practices, so that, everyone, especially our women in these entrepreneurial spaces, are treated equitably.
Thank you.
There's very little I can add other than to say that's all fantastic. I agree with all of it. I think the one thing I would say that I find as an opportunity is that, again, culturally, there are many things that we can look at in our Latino communities. And the idea of familia is a very strong one. And I think trying to look at the flexibility that makes families able to be stronger, I think leads to more vibrant communities and ultimately more fruitful societies altogether. And I think as we are more flexible and understanding of the things that people need to be successful in their work, the better we all are in the long run.
Thank you. And, I think I was mentioning during off screen, there is a lot of research out there that shows if you truly want to close the racial wealth gap, focus your investments on single Black and brown women head of households. That you will be able to have the greatest movement in closing that. And I think it is for many of the reasons that we already understand. I'm going to take this as an opportunity to quickly shift the conversation into something that is incredibly pressing and top of mind for many people here in the city. Since in the last year alone, we have seen more than 17,000 migrants arrive in Chicago, creating a humanitarian crisis. And those numbers continue to grow at an unprecedented rate. The crisis has become quite polarizing and has led to much debate on how to best address this. I truly believe that so much of the debate stems from a lack of actual understanding and a fear of depleted resources, particularly in communities that have been historically disinvested. I want to take a moment to explore what policies are needed at the local, state, and federal levels to ensure that Chicago remains a welcoming sanctuary city that has the capacity to support the growing migrant population while also remaining committed to addressing the existing needs of many of our Black and brown communities. Christina, I think I'm going to come to you first on this question. Would love to hear what is coming out of the administration.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think you are absolutely right in that people may not have a full, understanding or appreciation of the magnitude of what we are attempting to manage. And I say that because, as of August 31st, 2022, the governor of Texas took it upon himself to weaponize buses and to make a political statement about the border being, quote, overrun, and now testing cities that have claimed themselves to be sanctuary for undocumented individuals by busing individuals, sometimes not to even their knowledge of where their final destination is going to be, to see if we are able to live in our values. And so, you're right. We've topped over 18,000 since we have since the beginning, and we've had over 400 buses, 300 of those just in the time period of the Johnson administration. We have in our time stood up about 18 shelters. We are opening shelters one every 6 days. We have 11,000 people in shelters right now. We have 3,500 people in our police stations and in our airport staging areas. Those serve as our, quote, emergency shelter when we don't have or shelter beds available. And the journey usually is that once people, arrive via buses, if there's no shelter beds, they go to one of those staging areas and await a shelter bed. With our shelters, once you're actually in them, the whole process begins around case management, healthcare coordination and services, as well as legal assistance, which I know Miguel is going to talk a little bit about. But our ultimate goal is to resettle people or to reunite them with family members. And the state has provided us with resources to do that, to cover our case management, as well as asylum seeker emergency rental assistance for 6 months. We have been stressing kind of just the imperative that the federal government, needs to step in a large way. This is purely under the jurisdiction of the federal government, and the magnitude of what we are attempting to manage is impossible as a local government. And so just to give you all kind of a sense of really how, the disparity is, the state has invested $300 million into this operation since the beginning. We have invested $67 million. The federal government has invested $21 million. That is not even equivalent to our monthly burn rate with the 24 shelters that we currently operate and all of the wraparound supports that go with it. And so I just want to impress upon people how important it is to understand that this is purely an attack. We just got notice a week ago that Governor Abbott is increasing his fleet so that he can go from 100 buses to 200 buses. He is not respecting our curfew of sending buses between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. We ask that they do not come during that time because we do not have coverage for that. And plus, it's just dangerous to be riding at those hours. But he basically put out a message that he will be sending buses 24/7, 365 days a week, and at the tune of about 20 to 25 buses a day. Just in the past week, 7 days, we accepted 63 buses. And so this is not sustainable, nor is it humane in terms of how this is working, because we literally have individuals coming off the bus with shoes that are still wet from crossing the Rio Grande, and the fact that they are not knowing that they're coming to Chicago. This is reckless. And so we have really impressed upon the federal government to intervene. We still plan to hold the line and be, a welcoming city and provide sanctuary and ensure that we have, the resources in place. But at the same time, without federal intervention, it just becomes incredibly difficult. One of the highlights, and I'll pass it over to Miguel because I know that he's going to talk about this. We did join forces with the governor, as well as the business community, the labor community, and immigration advocates, to impress upon the federal government the need for the expanded temporary protective status, so that individuals who are coming into the country seeking asylum can have this status, and then also be able to apply for work authorization. That is ultimately the sustainability element of the work that we're doing with resettlement, because after the 6 months of rental assistance, you need to be able to obviously sustain that. And if you don't have legal authorization, you are subject to wage theft, to trafficking, and to other, employment practices that are harmful. So I'll stop right there, because I know there's more to kind of lay out, but I wanted people to fully understand and appreciate the scope and the magnitude of what we are attempting to manage, what we can control, because we don't control the buses, the frequency, and what the federal government does and does not do.
Christina, I know it's an incredibly complicated situation that we're in the midst of experiencing, right? It is evolving quite literally, like you said, on a daily basis. Miguel, I want to go over to you, because you are also on the front lines of helping to support this growing crisis as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate Christina's comments and just how challenging the situation is. I think there is one thing that in the narrative that too often is spoken in the media and things, is that this is an either or. Either we take care of communities that are in need here already, or migrants arriving. And I think that's an unfortunate dynamic. We have the talent and strength as a community to do both, and we should. That is the humanitarian response. I do think the things that are in our way right now are many of the things that simply, like Christina talked about, being able to put people in situations that are sustainable for them as their applications for asylum go forward. So in a normal case, when it might be even an ideal situation for an asylum case, in the sense that a person presents themselves and they have all the documentation needed to put that application together, those cases, even if they're happening quickly, take 4, 5, 6 years. And many of the people coming obviously are not coming with birth certificates and documentation to clearly identify who they are in the need for those applications. So having support from consulates that represent folks from different countries is absolutely necessary to get those documents expedited. I think certainly we also need to guard against bad actors out there who would exploit people who need to work and end up in situations then of human trafficking, where they are trying to do what they need to do to put food on the table for their families, but at the same time being exploited in ways that we don't have guards in place to make sure don't happen. So I think it's a multifaceted problem, but I think we also have the talent and leadership available within our city and the community organizations, many of who are represented here today, to not only deal with this problem, but put together a visionary plan that helps other cities in the country understand this is what it means to be a humanitarian and welcoming city. And so I think we have it within us to do it.
I agree wholeheartedly with you, Miguel. And this cannot be a zero-sum game, right? This has to be, this will shape the future of our city. It is here, we are living it, and it behooves us to address it and figure out the best way forward for all. I'm curious, Sylvia, from your perspective, from the trust perspective, what can be done from a philanthropic perspective, but also, in your purview, what can also be done from workforce development and other social service organizations who may have not been working with migrant populations in the past, but are also standing on the line, wanting to be a part of the solution. Curious as to kind of how the trust is towing this line as well.
Sure. Yeah. I think I agree with Miguel. It's both and, right? And I think it's not a zero-sum game. It's really thinking about collectively, this is an asset-based conversation, not a deficit-based one. And I think from the trust perspective, we're really looking at ways that we can help support and bring folks that are interested in funding or helping to the table. And so we have the Immigration Funders Collaborative, which is part of part of the trust that has specifically been focused in recent weeks on the temporary protective status. I think that was an exciting news component of this, that the federal government is expediting some of that temporary protective status for folks. But as Miguel and Christina were talking about, to be able to work, folks need the paperwork, they need the legal services, they need to be able to do that. And so we've been looking at how we can help legal aid societies fund some of that work, and get people to be able to help navigate some of that bureaucracy. Because I think when we're thinking about, again, kind of using that framework that I talked about before, we're in this emergency response moment, but how do we get to the economic recovery and the sustainability bigger picture? That work status is key, and thinking about how people can gain income, gain wealth, stabilize, and kind of create that focus. So I think we're working on the legal front and thinking about how we can partner there, how we can convene people. In addition, we continue to support on the workforce development front. I think having folks open up their doors and their training and their programs and thinking about how migrants can be a part of that work that's happening. So we continue to support groups like Latinos Progresando, who have a great nursing training program and getting folks in the door and getting people moving. So once folks have that work status, getting that training, or even maybe doing some of that training before the work status exists, can be a great way to kind of jump in and help here, so folks are ready to take on those jobs. I think we know frequently when people migrate, their credentials or any other, work certifications that they had before don't always translate. So thinking about that, I think, is another key component when we're talking here. I know also for the trust, we've been doing a lot of work with the undocumented populations in the past. And so really thinking about how we can continue to advocate for folks that are not always able to advocate for themselves. We've been working with undocumented workers to apply for the federal deferred action for labor enforcement, giving folks an opportunity where if they are working as an undocumented individual, ways to report things that are not functioning as the way they should, or if there are places where people are being taken advantage of. So I think across the board, we're thinking about this holistically. And know that uniquely for migrants, the work status is such a key component of them being successful.
Yeah. And like I said kind of a minute ago, what we know is that this will, as we talked at the top about kind of some of those pivotal things that have happened in our country over the past 100 years, and when we saw the influx of Latinos coming into the States, this will go down in history as kind of that next pivotal moment. And so my hope, Miguel, is something that you said, is that we are working together, that we have the brain, that we have the passion, that we all, I think, have that desire to work together to find those solutions, so that we are not finding ourselves in a place where folks are being taken advantage of, and that there is a pathway to citizenship, there is a pathway to working, and that they fold into, again, what helps make Chicago such an incredibly beautiful and very, very diverse city. I know that we can continue to talk about this topic, and I truly wish we had another hour, because I'd love to ask many more questions just on this topic alone. But I want to quickly, I want to make sure that we're saving space for our audience to ask at least a question or two, but I want to ask one final question of the entire panel. As we continue to work towards equitable economic and employment opportunities, not just for the Latino community, but truly for all communities that have experienced systemic barriers, what's one thing, and I know there's many things that we would want to happen, but what's one thing our audience can do that will help create greater access and more opportunities for all? And I'm going to go start with Ignacio.
Oh, thank you. So I would say, and I think Christina might have mentioned this before, we just need to acknowledge that there are barriers. Like, there's systemic racist barriers that are, and we as leaders should say, okay, we know that these sort of systems are out there. What do we need to do? I would also challenge our organizations, our schools, our nonprofits to strengthen our efforts and encourage the DEI work that's happening in our businesses, right? To find greater, identify minority leaders within that work. I know you said one thing, but I would also say two more things. I'd also encourage us to think about making higher ed more accessible, affordable. I've said that before. I think really continuing to revisit the Pell Map grant funds. I know there was just an increase in the last year, but I think more will be able to help. And then lastly, community engagement, right? I do, at the very heart of what we do as organizations, it's one thing to sort of understand and learn what's happening to our immigrant communities or Latino families, et cetera. It's one thing to sort of get that information secondhand. It's another for you to go and participate with community organizations, with faith-based groups who are really on the ground learning from the Black and Brown communities. That will help, right? Not only partnering with the community organizations, but also learning and walking away with very real understanding of what's going on, so that we can go back to our organizations and make those changes.
Wonderful. Sylvia?
I will say it's very hard to pick just one. But I think the barrier component, I think to me, dovetails really well with kind of the work we're doing at the Trust about building wealth. And I think one of the things that is really needed here is for people to build wealth, they need to be financially healthy to start out. And I think such a small segment of the population is financially healthy. So I think about 49% of white households are financially healthy, whereas Black households are at 13% and Latinos are at 16%. And so I think really thinking about how we reduce some of those barriers, thinking about how do you make education more affordable? How do you help people reduce debt so they can graduate and not have to pay student loans for 30 years after they graduate? I think thinking about childcare, thinking about transportation, all those different things that are needed, being able to have a household be financially healthy, I think is really kind of the beginning to be able to pull that together. And so I think from an employer perspective, thinking about how you have that comprehensive compensation package, what are those other pieces? I think from workforce development organizations, thinking about those barrier reduction funds and how those pieces come together. I think as funders, thinking about where you invest and how you make sure that it's not just the program, but it's those other components. I think there's just so many places where helping people get that footing to right the wrongs of past inequities, I think is really critical.
Christina, Miguel, any final thoughts that you would add?
I think I just would close with, we just, the mayor just gave his first budget address, and very much, promises made, promises kept kind of approach. But the main, one of his primary areas is on youth employment, and doubling the youth employment opportunities that over the course of the term, and then continuing to build on it. And I think when you invest in people, and specifically young people, in career exploration, in developing professional skills, in relationship and soft skill building, I think that it pays dividends in so many different ways, because young people are not just singular. They are a part of a family unit, that is embedded in a community, that has a broader impact. And when you provide them with purpose and relationships and skill building opportunities, I think it starts to reverberate across the community. And that's where I think we're going to see some of our biggest gains.
And I would just add, I think seeing every single situation we have as an opportunity for education. I think education is a direct line towards empowerment. And I think, if we are non-patronizing towards communities that are seeking assistance and start with what communities are asking for, I think long-term success is really within our reach. So
this has been truly amazing. Cristina, Ignacio, Sylvia, Miguel, incredibly grateful to each one of you. As I said before, I wish we had another hour. I will likely be reaching out to each one of you to ask you for another hour, because I think that this is an incredibly important topic, and we definitely don't want to lose sight of how this is shaping our city going forward. While we don't have time for questions at the time, I will mention there was one question from an organization that asked, where can they find organizations that are focused on supporting individuals looking for workforce training, programming? Cara Collective, that is what we do. We provide both of those wraparound supports to ensure that they are stable in order to enter the workforce, and then we provide a lot of that training and connection to employer opportunities. So please feel free to reach out to us post this conversation. To our audience, if you are feeling inspired by what you just heard and are interested in learning more about Cara Collective's work to fuel a courageous and national movement to eradicate poverty, I encourage you to to follow us on social media. Click below to subscribe to our YouTube channel and learn more about how you can engage in our mission at caracollective.org. Although I'm deeply thinking about asking us to change the name, like Ignacio, from Cara Collective to La Colectiva. I'm truly grateful to each one of you. Conversations with Cara is our annual series of virtual and in-person discussions centered around our work and the issues that we are all facing here in Chicago. If you would like to learn more about this series and ensure you are invited to the next one, please subscribe to our newsletter. The link is in the chat. We hope you'll all tune in on February 15th for our next conversation. One last tremendous thank you to our panel and to everyone who tuned in today. Let's continue to make it a great day.